everyone. The Skull Merchant is a character that has been controversial since her launch. She came out in 2023 in a really broken state during the 3-gen meta, where she was able to hold 3 gens extremely well. This led to a lot of people just hating her, gameplay-wise. Then across the years, she went through a number of reworks, or substantial changes at least. Behavior recently announced a 4th rework, so let's look at it today. I want to discuss these changes, and then also discuss Skull Merchant as a whole a bit at the end. To start off, I do want to say that I think these changes are definitely coming from the right place. In the opening part of this forum post, they seem to hit the nail on the head, I think, for why people didn't like her. Again, purely looking at gameplay in this instance. Many players feel she's not fun to play against, and her kit is exceedingly complex. This scares away potential killers from trying her, and makes it difficult for survivors to consider counterplay without dedicated research. So I do think this is true. I think there's a few extra notes to be made of that could have been added to this introductory sort of argument for why they're making these changes. For example, I think they could have mentioned the lack of clarity in her power originally, the way there's so many elements and you never really know exactly what she's meant to be doing. This led to confusion surrounding it because lots of people felt she was still the same way she was before. Lots of people tried to play her in the same way she was during the 3-gen meta. Years on, people don't really seem to know, which I think is what it comes down to with Merchant, is confusion around what she's really meant to be doing, what her power really is. So whilst I do agree it's complex, I think the issue more so lies with how it's received, sort of. Looking at someone like Singularity, say, sure, he has a complex power, but we know what Singularity is meant to be doing with it, right? In the case of Skull Merchant, I feel like that was never really clear, what her power was really meant to be doing. They list out 3 bullet points for what they want to get out of this rework. 1, strike a balance between being fun to play as and against. 2, preserve the intel focus of her kit, while making it intuitive to understand for both sides. That's really great, I think, and leads into the confusion point. 3, move away from a passive power with limited player interactions and embrace a more active playstyle, while ensuring her power is compensated in interesting ways. I do think this is important too, and I actually think this is partly why people were confused about what she did, even when they were playing her, is because she did have quite a passive playstyle in some senses. Not all, obviously. Again, it depended on how you played her, but part of the drones definitely were passive. And then there's a final remark before we actually jump into the rework here, which is basically just saying Skull Merchant is going to be completely changed, and lots of long-time Skull Merchant mains probably aren't going to like this rework, which is completely understandable because it is very different from how she was performing before, and I know that it was very dear to lots of people who did play her. And I do think it is a little sad in some senses, because whilst she did have a lot of problems, and whilst people did get quite upset with her, it's also important to realise that her power before wasn't really that sort of toxic or negative. It could use some changes, but part of the issue with Skull Merchant's whole perception is that she's been misperceived almost since her launch. I think it was about 3 months after, or maybe up to 5 months or something. But after that, since her launch, she's actually been sort of okay. She went through a few different phases, but her worst state, her worst 3-gen menace state, only existed for months of time. And this is something I feel like people get wrong a lot, because they always think this went on for years. They think she was still like this prior to her getting this huge nerf. And it's part of the reason, I think, and it shows, I think, the fundamental misunderstanding of her, and how little people have really actually paid attention, despite being so open to being quickly hateful or dismissive of her, due to the fact that she was in a particularly bad state on launch. It really is sort of a weird phenomenon, a character that has become so hated over time, that even when changes are made, and her place in the game does shift, it doesn't really change people's perspectives. So I do think, I do understand why they're doing this full rework and why they're establishing this as, oh, she's completely different. It makes sense to me because people sort of haven't seemed to have understood before the changes she has gone through, or they haven't thought of them as substantial enough to separate her from that original state. So I understand why they want to do this, why they would want to separate her away from that, why they want to finally, move her on, bring her into a state where people might finally accept her. So the first part of Skull Merchant's new kit is called Drone Control. Well, it's actually not quite the first part. The core part of her power is still going to be largely the same, with her drones being placed down and them being able to scan and detect survivors. This part of her power doesn't seem all too different, only now it doesn't seem like she's going to get stacks anymore or have anything to do with claw traps. These things are simply going to be for scanning and detecting where survivors are. Alongside this, the visual scan lines of the drones are going to be much more subtle and blend into the game's atmosphere a lot more. This allowing the drones to detect more easily, but also requiring survivors to have to be a little more cautious. So there's not too much to say about that. They're sort of just removing this aspect, and we'll go into, in the next part, the sort of first proper changes being made. But this part is definitely a little different, but drone scanning is still present, just slightly altered. The first proper new alteration or addition is called Drone Control. It's illustrated quite simply by this sort of GIF they attached to the to the forum post. Small note, but I actually think this is a really good idea, drawing these little doodles. I think it genuinely really helps to illustrate some points. There's so many times when they've written something, I think, where people have been quite confused about what they really mean. I think this genuinely clears it up quite a bit. Essentially, now when a stealth drone has been active for a short period, Skull Merchant can take control of the drone, move it around, and do sort of this propulsion to crash it into a survivor, causing a damage state. During this time, she goes undetectable. I'm sort of thinking of this sort of like an RCXD from, Call of Duty or something, except flying. You can sort of like move it around and then shoot it forward, that kind of thing. And when you do this, the drone then returns to you. And the purpose of this, they say, is for unique skill expression and to allow her sort of a skill shot with the drones. And I do actually sort of like the idea of this, the idea of repositioning drones in stealth mode so you can move them around a bit. I think that was always a really frustrating thing with her, is that you place one somewhere and then it's just sort of useless. Being able to move them around a bit like this now is actually quite nice. And the whole skill shot thing of being able to fly them and crash them into players, have a bit more map control, be able to act on things that are further away, I also think is quite nice. I do equally think that this is just a completely different killer, which they did mention, I suppose, at the start of the rework post, but this is genuinely just almost completely different. Already from the get-go, this is already a very different character, I think. No longer are we looking at, undetectable effects and haste effects and lots of different things with scan lines and tagging and things like that. It's just completely different. One thing that isn't different though is drone hacking, which is the next part. Now, if a survivor successfully hacks a drone, they actually see Skull Merchant's aura for a brief period. If they fail the hack, they get revealed with Killer Instinct and are unable to hack again for a short period of time. And I think this does achieve what they wanted, which is a greater degree of tension. Although this does initially sound like a bit too much of a nerf, maybe, in some aspects. It depends if the hack is as easy as it was before. If it's a simple input of 4 arrow keys, then, if you can reveal her aura after that, it's going to be pretty strong. So I think that's going to need a bit of balancing, but I do think the idea there is sound. The final thing she's getting is a global detection power, which reminds me a lot of a power from a Rainbow Six Siege operator called Lion. Once this power is charged and activated, a global warning plays for all survivors. For a short period afterwards, any survivor who actively sprints is revealed on the Skull Merchant's radar. So it's sort of meant to be this activatable thing. You press it, everyone has to stand still and stop moving or they get detected. They can also avoid it by crouching, standing still, and hiding in lockers. If not, they get revealed by an aura. And I actually quite like the sound of this. I think this could be quite cool, and actually does provide another case of a sort of a risk-reward situation. Do you push through something to get a gen done, or go get a save, or whatever else, right? Or do you stand still? Do you stop what you're doing? One thing I do hope is that I hope it's not for like a really long time. I hope it's like 4 or 5 seconds maybe. Otherwise I think this could be a little bit busted, but I like the idea. What I like about this rework as a whole actually is I think all of the ideas, all of these concepts are genuinely really cool. And they're all things, honestly, that sound like what we should have got originally with a tracking or a drone-based power. It's the kind of thing I can imagine them creating instead of the original Skull Merchant. This is also something I can see being a lot more sort of digestible, I think, for players. I think already reading through this and hearing this initially, it's instantly more clear. Even as someone who had I think a decent understanding of how Skull Merchant worked before. I wasn't some master or anything. I also didn't play her all that much, but I think I got how she worked. But admittedly, it did take me a little while because of how lacking in clarity she originally was, how little there was to actually explain what she did, both in-game but also online more widely, because she doesn't have that many players. Reading through this now, it's a bit substantial still. There's still a lot going on, I think, but each of these segments is very clear and very easy to understand. Which I also want to clarify, I don't think this should be the standard for every rework, you know. It doesn't. I think the idea that every power has to be simplistic or whatever is maybe going a bit too far, but I do think it needs to be comprehensible by the majority of the player base, and I think before, a lot of the player base genuinely did struggle to comprehend what Skull Merchant did. I know I did, especially with how many reworks she went through, how many changes she got. It's almost not like fair, I think, to complain about the player base not understanding her, because how are we meant to when she was changing so much? And you know, especially in small ways, like with her numbers or her status effects, or how, like, you know, scan lines were performing, how drones were performing, all of these things that if you're not someone who reads patch notes, you probably wouldn't pick up on it. Compared to something like this, it's going to be quite obvious there's a substantial change rate. I think that was part of the issue. The final comment here on the forum post is about the release, and they're currently evaluating a timeline for Skull Merchant's rework, but it's probably quite far out still. My assumption here is this is going to be anywhere from the second sweep of changes in July onwards to anywhere up to the end of the year in like December or something. I want to add quickly too that I'm really happy they're deciding to do these design previews. This is a really good idea, I think. Presenting the ideas to the player base first, seeing what they all say, seeing how people react, getting all the comments you can in, and then launching a PTB. I think that's just simply a great idea. Imagine if this had been done in the case of the Twins rework, or even originally with the other Skull Merchant reworks. I think these things could have been sorted much faster with these presentations to the player base. Not that I'm saying the player base actually even is always right. I think a lot of the time the devs pushing through things and forcing releases almost and saying, oh no, this is going to be good, does actually work out a lot of the time. But anyway, that's the Skull Merchant rework, the third or fourth one. It depends how you separate the reworks, I suppose. Overall, I think this is sort of a bittersweet thing. It's a case where it's sort of sad because Skull Merchant before her big nerf last year was actually in a fairly decent state. She was actually quite enjoyable if you could understand and you put in the time to sort of, you know, like partly learning her, I think. But the issues she had and the issues outlined in this post are completely true as well. She was still just horribly hated. She was hated for a state she'd not been in quite some time, but regardless of that, she was still very hated. People still viewed her in the same way, and the perception of the character is in some ways more important than what she actually was, because sure, she might have been changed, she might have been largely different, but if people didn't see her that way, then there's almost not much point to it, because point proven by it actually happening, even when she was changed around and she was in a decently balanced state, I think, people still didn't like her. People still thought of her the same way. People didn't really understand she was even changed in some cases. People thought she was still like her old version. Doing this rework is definitely going to stop those comments now, because based on these listed changes, she's going to be completely different. it's going to take some willful ignorance of the situation now to not realize that she's different from her prior state, I think, compared to before, where, you know, it's plausible someone who doesn't read forums or patch notes could reasonably think she was in a fairly similar state, I think. I do think that this is a bit of a sad and sorry state for the people that did really like her in her prior state, in her sort of rework state from her original one. As again, it wasn't that bad in my opinion. I had fun with it. But what matters more than anything, I do think, is perception. If the player base perceives her differently despite any changes, then it doesn't matter, I think, really. If the sort of the stigma is still there, if people still feel that hatred regardless of the changes, then in some ways they weren't really successful, I think. And I think doing these ones is going to change that. Probably not completely, because the whole hate on Skull Merchant is something that's almost ingrained as like a meme at this point into the community. It's one of those things I think simply isn't going away. It's going to always be there. People are always going to reference it. They're always going to sort of meme on it a little bit. But doing this rework, I think, at least opens up the possibility to her getting a bit of a different rap, a bit of a different perspective. And the whole Skull Merchant hate does become purely a meme, rather than it being only sort of partially a meme at the moment. The sad part is it comes at the cost of the players who did like her before sort of getting, well, a bit fucked over, I guess. Especially as before, she was a very unique character compared to a lot of the wider roster. These changes, at least some of them, do make her fall more in line with other killer powers, like the drone propulsion, the sort of a skill shot, is similar to what other killers have. The other parts of the kit, I think less so. I think the sort of global tracking system thing is just a pretty cool, unique idea that I can't really think of something they've done before in that sort of branch, but I don't know, who knows, maybe I'm missing something. I do think, though, to sort of conclude, that these changes do genuinely have the chance to change the perspective on Skull Merchant, and I think there's very little, actually, that could have done that aside this, which I think is sort of a key thing to note. And I almost think if this had been done as the initial rework, it could have maybe saved her a lot earlier on. Granted, we wouldn't have gotten those other states, which I think, again, were pretty enjoyable. But I just think this was the right thing to do, ultimately. It doesn't make it any less sad in some senses also, but I do think it's the right thing, especially for the character and the wider community perspective on the Skull Merchant. Simplifying her down, giving her clear-cut abilities, is something that is going to surely clear up the misunderstanding surrounding her character. They have to. I would be shocked if this didn't end up, you know, clearing people's perspectives of her at least a little bit. But again, it doesn't change the fact that it does have this sort of tinge of sadness, even though I do think it's going to more widely be a positive for the community. It's just one of those things where I think it's tough to know what the right thing to do is, quote unquote, whether it's to keep her in the way she was, appeal to a more niche player base, or try to, you know, revamp her entirely like this and give the wider community a fresh perspective on her. Again, either way, it's a bit of a gamble, because on one hand you annoy the niche player base, but you appeal to the wider player base, but then the wider player base haven't been very accepting to her historically. So I think it's still a bit of a gamble in that sense, especially as it's one of those reworks I can't really see them releasing and putting out to live, and then realizing it doesn't work and re-rolling, for example. If this comes to live, she's staying this way. It's a permanent change, I think. The key thing, of course, is the PTB, and I think that's really going to be the deciding factor, because whilst these changes do sound really good on paper, it's one of those things you also need to see play out, I think. So again, I think first of all, see these things play out on the PTB. Initial thoughts are a bit mixed, but I'm mostly leaning too positive. I think these are really good changes, and it's a different character now, but I do think it's a fun and interesting sounding character. And I do definitely think they've ticked the boxes, they've achieved what they set out to do. And regardless of the outcome here, I think it's just a real positive they've done this design preview at all. The fact they're doing these now, I think, is simply incredible. So that's where I'm going to leave off for today. I do hope you enjoyed. Thank thanks for watching. Be sure to let me know your thoughts too down below. I'm really interested to hear everyone's thoughts on this. This whole thing was very sudden. I honestly expected this to be another situation a bit like Twins, like, oh, a rework's coming, but it's going to be, you know, like a couple years on. I genuinely thought that, so I'm really happy to see this is getting some motion so quickly. So there we have it. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.